Hi, everyone. Happy 4th of July. Happy Independence Day for those of us on this side of the pond. Happy Election Day for those of you on the other side of the pond who might be watching this. Wanted to talk a little bit about Britain, about 1990s and football coming home, because we're in the middle of the Euros. We're hearing a lot about it's coming home again, right? This seems to be the theme anytime England plays in a major tournament. It's funny, when Scotland makes a major tournament, they don't say that, even though the rules of football were codified in England. But the modern game, or what we would say the origins of the modern game, quite possibly may have started in Scotland. And I think that that's something we always have to acknowledge. I always try and acknowledge when the English claim they invented this sport, right? It came from the British Isles. We can agree on that. Anyway, the 1990s were a very interesting time, and I've been thinking about it a lot recently because of the Euros are going to go back to the British Isles in 2028, because of the predominance of the Premier League, which has become kind of preeminent in football conversations, particularly in the English language, and the U.S. hosting another World Cup in 2026, as we did in 1994. So it feels like the 90s are happening all over again. And the 1990s began with England making the semifinals of the 1990 World Cup under Sir Bobby Robson, in a bit of a lucky run, but fortunate win over Cameroon in the knockout stages of that tournament, and then unfortunate loss on pens in the semifinals, obviously. But the Premier League was created with the help of Rupert Murdoch and Sky in the early 1990s. And that kind of changed the trajectory of football globally. It put England where the sport was rules were codified. It put England right back front and center, because entering the 1990s, I don't want to get into Heysel and everything that had happened in the 1980s, which was really a horrible time in Britain, not just on the football side, but just a horrible time for a lot of people in that country. It put the British Isles, and put England specifically, right back in the center of the footballing world, and you took a league that was not one of the best leagues in the world, the English First Division, entering the 1990s. And by the time we get to 2006, it's the biggest media power in the world of football. And then by the time you get to 2015, it's arguably the best league in the world. And I think there were periods, and actually I should say from 2005 to 2009, the Premier League was the best league in the world. 2005 to maybe 2010, and until Pep got to Barcelona. 2005 to 2009, I think there's a clear period where the Premier League is the best league in the world. So you go from 92, when the Premier League is formed, and England is not, the English First Division is not of a very high standard. In fact, you had a lot of players. We talk about the period between 1984 and 1996 being the dark era, dark ages in U.S. soccer, where we didn't have a recognized First Division league. You still had guys who were playing at First Division clubs in England come play in the United States in our outdoor leagues. You still have guys at that point leaving the First Division of England and playing indoor soccer in the United States. I mean, I'm not kidding. There were, and that ends in 1992. That ends. That's over. But it was an important decade, I think, in repositioning England at the center of the football map. Having the World Cup in the United States, which England, interestingly enough, did not qualify for, right? The only country from the British Isles that qualified was the Republic of Ireland. But it made the English language again a little bit more preeminent in the game, having a World Cup in the U.S. and the U.S. taking an interest in the sport, and Major League Soccer launching in 1996, and all of the other leagues in the United States, the USISL league system, which it's the forerunner of USL, began to really take off in that period too, in the late 90s. England hosts Euro 96. It is a celebration of football and football coming home, and England did very well in that tournament. Unfortunately, lost on pens to Germany in the semifinals when Gareth Southgate missed a penalty. Stuart Pearson missed a penalty in 1990. I mentioned the 1990 match earlier. Both of those were defenders, by the way. and both of whom would become England managers in the future. So it was an interesting decade from that perspective. And then also the Premier League becoming front and center. And then I don't want to make this channel political. I've tried to avoid that. But 1997, Tony Blair is elected as Prime Minister of the UK. And there's this cool Britannica vibe he pushes. And I'm not a fan of Blair. I think, there are a lot of people who call him a centrist, right? Because they're looking at economics. But from a social issues perspective, I think he was kind of a left-wing revolutionary. But that's my opinion. Okay, that's my opinion. But part of that revolution was pushing cool Britannica. And Britain, as I said, the 80s were a tough time. And it was kind of a dreary time to be in Britain. And Britain's cultural influence was beginning to diminish. The James Bond franchise, actually, ironically enough, had trouble in that period. And you weren't hearing as much music from Britain and film and television from Britain being exported to other English-speaking countries. That kind of changes in the 90s. And London becomes a financial capital or a center of services. But at the heart of that was football. At the heart of that was the fact that the Premier League now was this great boxed-up product made for television, with traditional clubs, with clubs that had been around for over 100 years in many cases. Made for television, exported to the rest of the world, that put Britain and England specifically very much at the forefront and the center of the footballing world. So as a result of football coming home, you see the growth of interest in the sport in the United States, which we've talked about. You see the interest in the growth of the sport in Australia. Australia had qualified for the 1978 World Cup. They always had football among the ethnic communities, Italian and Croatian communities in particular in Australia, but really becomes more mainstream in the 90s. They start their own league as well, the A-League. You see the growth of football in places like Vietnam, Malaysia, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, places where English is widely spoken. Nigeria, whose football comes along in the 90s, but also interest in the global game grows in Nigeria, and Ghana because of the Premier League. And so what the 1990s did, and what putting England at the center of the football map did in the 1990s, is grow the sport into a global behemoth. Yes, football was always the most popular game globally, but until it was embraced in English language speaking countries outside of the British Isles, which it quite frankly had not been prior to even in places like the West Indies, right? A lot of those English speaking countries, cricket was the primary sport. You could argue it still is in some cases. Cricket is more popular than football in Australia. Cricket is more popular than football in India. But cricket is not any longer more popular than football in the West Indies. Cricket never became popular in Africa outside of kind of, again, I don't want to get into politics, but the countries that had white minority governments pushed cricket, South Africa and Rhodesia, South Rhodesia, which is now Zimbabwe, Namibia as well. So, it was a huge boost for the sport. And the reason I want to talk about it on July 4th is, one, England is alive in the Euros, obviously. So we're going to hear football's coming home until they're eliminated. Switzerland is a country that I follow closely in football and have written about actually this week on Beyond the 90, and I rate them highly. So, maybe they knock them out, maybe they don't. We'll see. But I think it had a tremendous influence on the growth of the sport in the United States, was England being at the center of the football map instead of Italy, which had the best league in throughout most of the 90s. Or Spain, which had obviously had the big clubs in Real Madrid and Barcelona, or Germany, which is my personal favorite league. That's the culture I connect to most readily in terms of this sport. Maybe why I've taken a keen interest in Switzerland and Austria, who I'm really got eliminated in a classic match against Turkey in the Euros. Maybe that's why I've taken interest in German-speaking countries. But that is, I'm not putting my own experience at the center of this. I'm trying to put the experience of what I've observed in football in the United States. So happy Independence Day for us. happy election day for those of you on the other side of the pond. And football came home in the 90s, and it also spurred the growth of football, soccer here in the United States.